Winter enters a monastery without knocking. It slides through the cloister in the dark hours before dawn. It crawls over wet flagstones, presses against leaded glass, and settles into the very bones of the building. Stone walls sweat with cold. Breath turns pale in candlelight. Somewhere beyond the gate, the wind is dragging sleet across fields and grave markers, and inside, a monk must somehow sleep, rise, pray, and do it all again tomorrow. Most people imagine medieval monks as men who simply endured this. Bare stone, thin blankets, heroic suffering, as if holiness meant lying down in an icebox and waiting for morning. It is a powerful image. It is also deeply misleading, because the real secret was not endurance alone. It was design. Hidden in architecture, cloth, wood, straw, routine, and rule, medieval monks built a quiet technology of survival. They did not usually heat the whole room. They did something more clever. They created warmth where it mattered most, trapped it, protected it, and turned even a freezing stone cell into a workable human shelter. The medieval monastery is often imagined as a fortress of misery, and in some ways it was austere. The life was disciplined, sleep was interrupted, comfort was suspect. Luxury could be condemned as softness of the soul. But austerity is not the same thing as stupidity. Monks were not trying to die of cold, they were trying to remain functional, to rise for the night office, to copy manuscripts without numb fingers, to sing in choir before sunrise, to stay alive through long winters in places where stone buildings held damp like a sponge and fuel was precious. If a monastery failed at that, prayer itself would falter. The rhythm of the house would break. So the question is not why monks tolerated the cold. The real question is how they managed it. And the answer is more impressive than a simple fire on the floor. In fact, open fire was often the one thing they could not rely on. A brazier could suffocate. A spark could destroy timber roofs, books, cloth, and stores. A monastery was full of dry wood, wax, parchment, and straw. Fire was useful, yes. But inside sleeping spaces, it was also a predator. So monks learned a harder lesson, one that people in harsh climates have understood for centuries. When heating the whole building is impossible, you do not warm the world around you. You shrink the world. You build a small island of survivable heat around the human body. That system had one central principle. Do not try to heat the stone. Heat the monk. Once you see that, the whole puzzle starts to open. Warmth came from layers. Layers of architecture, layers of bedding, layers of clothing, layers of routine. The goal was not to turn a cell into summer. The goal was to slow heat loss so the body could keep its own small furnace alive. Think of it as medieval thermal engineering without the name. First, block the wind. Then, separate flesh from stone. Then, trap air. Then, manage moisture. Then, use the daily rhythm of the monastery itself to help the body endure the cold hours. That is the forgotten intelligence of the monastic winter. Not one miracle technique, but a chain of practical decisions, each modest on its own, powerful when combined. And the first part of that chain was the building itself. From the outside, a monastery looks exposed. Inside, its layout could be surprisingly strategic. Monastic buildings were often arranged around a cloister, an enclosed courtyard that acted as a buffer. Ranges of buildings shielded one another from the wind. A cell or dormitory tucked within that arrangement was not facing the open world on every side. It was wrapped by corridors, adjoining rooms, and the mass of the complex itself. That mattered. A chamber pressed between other chambers loses less heat than a lone hut standing in open weather. Even cold buildings can protect one another simply by being grouped closely. The monastery in that sense behaved like a body of connected organs, each moderating the other. Openings were kept small for a reason. Small windows admitted less light, yes, but they also meant fewer places for warmth to escape. Shutters, cloth coverings, oiled parchment in some contexts, and glazed panes where available all helped reduce drafts. Doors might be thick wood, sometimes hung with extra cloth, or fitted to reduce the bite of moving air. Lime plaster on interior walls could help seal cracks and reflect light, making a room feel drier and more controlled. None of this made the room warm, but it made it less vulnerable. And in a northern winter, less vulnerable can be the difference between sleep and misery. Then came the second trick, Monks understood, even if they never described it in modern terms, that the body must be separated from cold mass. That is why a bed mattered so much, not because it was luxurious, but because it lifted a sleeper away from the floor and created a thermal break. A wooden frame was already an improvement over bedding spread directly on stone. Boards, rope supports, or pallets interrupted the drain of heat from flesh into masonry. Even a simple platform changed the physics of the night. Wood was warmer to the touch than stone because it pulled heat away more slowly. That sensation is not merely psychological, it is physical. In a cold chamber, every surface that is not stone becomes precious. So beds, stools, chests, shelves, screens, and lining boards all mattered. In some monasteries, richer or stricter houses may also have used wood paneling, partitions, or textile hangings where resources allowed. Not everywhere, not always, but enough to remind us that the medieval interior was not necessarily a naked stone box. People who lived in cold masonry knew the cruelty of bare walls. Where they could, they softened the envelope, a little timber, a hanging cloth, a screen near the bed. Each one carved out a smaller climate within the larger room. Now we come to the real heart of the secret. The bed was not a single object. It was a stack of technologies. At the base might be straw, rushes, or chaff stuffed into a mattress or tick. That sounds crude to modern ears, but loose plant material traps air, and trapped air is one of the oldest forms of insulation in human history. Straw mattresses could compress, grow dusty, and need replacement, but they still created a warmer layer than stone or bare boards. Above that came blankets, coverlets, furs, or woolen layers, depending on the wealth and rules of the house. Wool was especially powerful in damp cold. It insulates even when not perfectly dry, resists chilling better than many plant fibers, and traps warmth close to the body. A rough wool blanket might not feel luxurious, but in a medieval winter, it was close to life-saving. Linen also had a role, not because it was warm by itself, but because it handled sweat and skin contact differently. Moisture is a silent killer in cold environments. If bedding becomes damp from breath, skin, or the room itself, warmth collapses. Layers that could be aired, changed, dried, and maintained gave monks a better chance of sleeping warm enough to recover. And sometimes, where resources permitted, there were better fillings still. Feather beds, quilts, padded coverlets, not in every cell, not in every order, and certainly not as a universal standard. But the point is that monastic sleep was not always a romance of deliberate discomfort. Houses with means often invested in bedding, because bedding was not mere pleasure. It was infrastructure. It preserved bodies that had work to do for God before dawn. There was another piece of the puzzle people often forget. The warmest room is not always the warmest bed. A bed enclosed by curtains or set within a confined sleeping space can hold warmth far better than an open one. Bed hangings are often associated with nobles and great chambers, but the principle itself is much older and wider than elite. Luxury. Create a small volume of air, block drafts, let body heat collect. Suddenly, a cold room becomes survivable. Even without elaborate curtains, a narrow alcove, a screened corner, or a close-built wooden frame could reduce moving air around the sleeper. This mattered because wind is a thief. It does not need to be dramatic. A slow current slipping through a crack can strip away the warmth gathered under blankets all night long. So the monks fought not only cold, but motion. Still air was an ally. This is why the difference between a drafty cell and a controlled one could feel enormous, even if the stone walls were equally cold. Warmth is not only about temperature. It is about whether heat stays where a human body can keep using it. Modern people often imagine sleep as something done in special garments, in a temperature-controlled room, after a predictable evening. That was not the medieval pattern. Monks in colder regions often slept in ways shaped by rule, practicality, and the need to rise quickly. The exact custom varied by time and order, but clothing remained part of the thermal system. A woolen habit, under tunic, hood, cap, stockings, or night layers, could make a profound difference. Cover the head, and the body keeps more warmth. Cover the feet, and the entire bed feels less hostile. In a world without central heating, the line between clothing and bedding was thin. You wore insulation. You lay inside insulation. You woke and put one layer of insulation over another. And because monks often rose during the night, Sleeping partly clothed could also be practical. There was little sense in freezing while dressing for the office in a black room before dawn. The body that stayed warmest was the body that wasted the least heat on transition. Again, this was not extravagance, it was efficiency. Surely they used fire. Yes, but carefully, and not as the easy answer people assume. Most monasteries had a warming house, a designated heated room where monks could briefly recover some heat, especially in severe weather. Kitchens, bakehouses, workshops, and infirmaries also generated warmth. In some cases, hot stones, warmed objects, or limited heating devices may have been used. But the ordinary sleeping solution was rarely a cozy fireplace in every cell. Fuel was labor, fire was risk. And the very architecture that made a monastery durable could also make smoke and ventilation a nightmare in small chambers. A little heat in the wrong place could turn comfort into catastrophe. So fire existed within a disciplined map of allowed spaces, not as a universal cure. That fact makes the monastic solution even more impressive. When abundant flame is off the table, every blanket, board, shutter, and habit becomes more important. Every small design choice carries more weight. Warmth becomes a matter of management, not abundance. Cold alone is harsh. Cold and damp together are merciless. This may be the most important part of the story because medieval monks were not only fighting temperature, they were fighting wetness. Stone walls could sweat, breath condensed, bedding absorbed moisture, wool could protect. But if everything became clammy and stayed that way, the body lost heat faster and illness spread more easily. So monastic warmth depended on constant maintenance. Beds had to be aired, straw had to be changed, blankets had to be dried, rooms had to be cleaned, plaster repaired, shutters fastened, leaks dealt with, and stores protected from rot. A winter monastery survived not through one heroic invention, but through repeated acts of upkeep. The system failed the moment damp was allowed to win. This is where the quiet labor of the community becomes visible. Someone gathered rushes, someone beat and aired bedding, someone repaired hinges, someone mended wool, someone cut timber, sealed roof lines, patched mortar, cleaned drains, and kept the house from becoming a cold sponge. Warmth was maintained by hands, not theories. Behind every sleeping monk stood a network of workers. Some were monks themselves, some were lay brothers, some were hired craftsmen. Carpenters built frames, shutters, and doors. Masons maintained walls and vaults. Shepherds and herdsmen provided wool, skins, and tallow. Weavers, fullers, and seamstresses turned fiber into usable insulation. Servants or brothers aired bedding, carried fuel, and managed stores. A monastery could appear still from a distance. Inside, it was a machine of care and labor, and this matters because the warmth of a cell was social before it was personal. A monk did not simply own his comfort. He depended on a house that functioned, on barns that were filled before the snows, on cloth that had been woven months earlier, on roofs repaired before autumn rains, on forests managed for fuel, on animals kept alive through winter, on rules that balanced ascetic ideals with practical survival. Even prayer was part of this engineering culture, not as magic, but as discipline. A disciplined house rose on time, stored correctly, rationed carefully, repaired promptly, and expected every member to understand that neglect had consequences. One broken shutter could mean a miserable night. One damp mattress could lead to sickness. One roof leak could ruin not just sleep, but cloth, books, and morale. The monastic world was spiritual, it was also logistical. Monasteries were not frozen in time. Practices changed from century to century, region to region, and order to order. Wealthier houses could afford better glazing, heavier textiles, improved timberwork, and more robust stores. Stricter communities might emphasize plainness while still adopting effective solutions that did not look luxurious. Infirmaries could be warmer than ordinary sleeping spaces. Northern houses needed stronger winter strategies than milder climates. Separate cells required one pattern of adaptation. Communal dormitories required another, but the logic remained, remarkably consistent. Reduce exposed space, separate body from cold surfaces, trap air in layers, protect against drafts, control moisture, use fuel where safest and most useful, keep the human body functioning through routine, not comfort alone. That is why the solution feels so modern in spirit, even if it is medieval in material. It is systems thinking. It recognizes limits. It understands trade-offs. It refuses the fantasy of total control and instead builds resilience from many small advantages. In other words, the monks did not conquer winter, they negotiated with it. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson of all. The medieval monk did not live in a world where nature could be switched off. There was no thermostat to turn, no hidden furnace humming in the walls, no assumption that buildings should erase the season outside. Winter remained present. You heard it in the shutters. You saw it in your breath. You felt it in the flagstones underfoot before dawn, but the response was not surrender. It was measured adaptation. Monastic culture valued restraint, order, and repetition. Those same values produced good cold weather engineering. A man who learns to value routine can survive with less waste. A community that plans carefully can turn ordinary materials into powerful shelter. A rule that discourages excess can still allow wisdom. In fact, it may sharpen it. Because once luxury is removed, intelligence has to do more work. That is what makes these sleeping systems so compelling. They reveal a medieval mind that was observant, practical, and deeply aware of the body's limits. The goal was not to build a palace in winter. The goal was to preserve attention, prayer, memory, and labor inside a hostile climate, not comfort for its own sake. Function in the face of cold. There is something profound in that. A monk pulling a wool blanket closer in a dark stone chamber was not simply enduring discomfort. He was lying inside the accumulated knowledge of a whole. Civilization, shepherding, weaving, carpentry, masonry, agriculture, storage, rule, and repair. Around him were walls built to block wind, shutters hung to tame drafts, bedding layered to trap air, clothing chosen to retain heat, and a community structured to keep the system alive. The cell was small. The intelligence inside it was not. So how did medieval monks sleep warm in freezing stone cells? Usually not by turning those cells into heated rooms. They slept warm by refusing to waste heat on what did not matter. They built warmth close to the body and defended it with every tool they had. Thick walls, tight plans, shutters, wood, wool, straw, linen, raised beds, enclosed air, dry bedding, disciplined fuel use, and relentless maintenance. It was not one secret. It was an architecture of restraint. And maybe that is why it feels almost invisible to us now. We are trained to look for dramatic machines, hidden furnaces, lost inventions of iron and flame. But some of the most effective medieval technologies were quieter than that. A mattress stuffed with straw, a wool blanket aired before dusk, a shutter closed against sleet, a bed lifted off stone, a hood kept on through the night office. A whole monastery arranged so that winter could be endured without being invited inside. That is not romantic suffering. That is skilled survival. In the end, the monks' warm sleep was not a contradiction of austerity. It was proof that discipline and practicality could live together. The cold was real. The stone was real. The hardship was real. But so was the intelligence that answered it. And if a community with no central heating, little spare fuel, and every reason to fear fire could still carve out islands of warmth inside winter's grip, what other lost systems of ancient engineering are hiding in plain sight around us? If there's another Viking or ancient engineering mystery you want explored next, leave it in the comments.